Hello learners, and welcome to another module of the course Fundamentals of Economics and Financial Market. Today, in this week's module, we'll be discussing and dealing with various aspects that are there in macroeconomics. We'll be doing with the theory of employment, that is specifically the Keynes theory of employment, consumption function, factors affecting the consumption function, and the theories related to the consumption income relationship. So first and foremost, let's start theory of employment that was given by Keynes. In this theory of employment, today we'll be covering the topics of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and effective demand that was given by Keynes. But before having an idea and discussing about the Keynes theory of employment, it is necessary that why Keynes gave this theory. What was an earlier theory that Keynes found that was beset with certain flaws, and he gave theory of employment, income and output determination as an improvement in that theory. See, before Keynes, there was classical theory of employment given by classical economists. That whole theory was based on certain assumptions. Certain assumptions of laissez-faire policy. Laissez-faire policy is the non-intervention of government. Full employment. Full employment implies all the given resources in the economy are fully utilized and there is no excess capacity left in the economy. Along with that, it was a very important thing that laid the foundation of the whole theory or classical theory of employment was the Say's law of market. Jean-Baptiste Say, J.B. Say, a very profound economist at that time, gave this Say's law of market, which said supply creates its own demand. That means whatever would be produced in an economy, whatever is the supply, whatever number of units or output is there in the economy, that output would definitely create its own demand. And if for some time there is excess of supply that occurs, then that is a temporary phenomenon. At that point of time, the producer will reduce or restrict its supply, and then when again that given amount is utilized, supply would again be generated. So whatever is supplied in the economy would definitely create its own demand. Therefore, the resources will fully be utilized, and that would be the level of determinant of employment, that is where the demand for labor is equal to supply of labor. In 1936, Keynes, in his General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, that was published at that time, he gave a very frontal attack on these classical postulates. His few criticisms include, first and foremost, Keynes rejected the fundamental assumption of full employment. He said that full employment can be a special condition that can be achieved as a specific condition, but full employment is not prevalent in the economy every time. There can exist certain amount of involuntary unemployment. He further repudiated the Say's law of market and said that all income that an individual is earning need not necessarily be spent in consumption also. Income can be further divided, its utilization, its usage can be further bifurcated. It is not only the consumption that an individual is spending his income. So that was also a criticism and an attack for the classical theory. He did not agree 100% with laissez-faire policy, but to a certain extent Keynes' ideas were also influenced by the classical, and he agreed upon the concept of laissez-faire policy, that government has a limited interference in the economy. He further criticized the classical theory that this theory does not recognize the speculative demand. Speculative demand concept was given by Keynes. We will be discussing this speculative demand Then we will be discussing the Keynes theory further in these slides. So I'll make it clear what is speculative demand at that point of time. Furthermore, classical regarded money as a neutral agent. Howsoever, Keynes said money cannot act as a passive agent. It is always an active agent, and presence of money supply do have an influence on various variables. With these criticisms, Keynes' theory of employment came to existence. So what Keynes said, that logical starting point when we see of the Keynes theory is the theory of effective demand. Now the question arises, what is effective demand? How does it is related to the level of employment? See, in economics, in common parlance, we say demand is a desire, a want, when backed by a purchasing power. That means any demand becomes effective when income is spent in buying the consumption of goods and investment goods, both. That means what? If you have a desire to buy something, that demand is not effective. If you have money to buy something, but you don't want to buy anything, that is also not effective. But if you have a desire and you have income and you are willing to buy consumer goods as well as investment goods, then that demand becomes effective. So, Keynes said that in a capitalist economy, the level of employment always depends on the effective demand. What Keynes used the term effective demand to denote was that the total demand of goods and services at various level of employment. That means the number of laborers an economy is hiring, a producer is hiring, a manufacturer is hiring, at that point of time, what is the demand for consumer goods and services? That would determine the effective demand. Thus, he said, point where supply fully meets the demand, that point would be called as the point of effective demand. Thus, output, employment and income, we'll be starting with that to understand the Keynes theory. According to Keynes, income, that is the national income. National income is the sum total of all the goods and services produced within the national boundaries during a year, is one way of expressing the national income. So what Keynes said is that national income Y, it is a function of the level of employment, and in turn this level of employment N depends on effective demand. How many people will you employ for a specific level of output would be determined by what is the effective demand of the goods and services produced. Now this effective demand would in turn depend on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So let's start and learn what is this aggregate demand and aggregate supply that are the determining factor of effective demand. But before starting the Keynes theory of employment, let us go through the assumptions what Keynes gave towards his theory. Keynes said that theory of employment is a short period theory. That means whatever they are determining, the level of employment, what Keynes was propounding and what Keynes was analyzing, what Keynes theory determined was in the short period of time. He has not considered the long run time. Second important thing what he took as assumption was there exists a perfect competition in the labor and the product market. Perfect competition basically implies large number of buyers and sellers, perfect knowledge of the product, firm is the price taker, industry is the price maker, homogeneity of product is there. These all are characteristics of perfect competition. He also assumed an economy that is closed. Closed economy means that the economy is not opened for international borders. That means whatever we are doing, if I take an example of Indian economy, that means there is no open boundaries, so that the international things happening around would affect our economy. So that is the concept of closed economy. Further, Keynes said कि whatever relationship we are deriving of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, the relationship which we are deriving, he completely ignores the role of government as a spender or taxer. That means the total income what he is analyzing in the economy, what the laborer would be getting or the producer would be getting, no tax is imposed on that income, plus government is not doing any kind of public expenditure that would have an impact on the money supply and in turn would have an impact on the consumption. Labor was taken as the only factor of production. So in economics we have land, labor, capital. So Keynes took only labor as the factor of production. Further, he said that labor has money illusion. Money illusion basically means that we are in a mirage, that the labor sometimes comes into the mirage that his nominal wages or the current wages are the actual wages. And the consumption pattern is affected by the nominal wages and the labor is not realizing that what are his real wages. Earlier in the discussion we have said that real wages, when we divide the wages by price, that becomes the real wages for the labor. Basically, those wages, what purchasing power is being contained in those wages. So labor suffers from money illusion. Money is not neutral. It acts as a store of value. If we carry money, that money, we can purchase something with that money, maybe consumption goods, investment goods, both. Further, Keynes assumed there is no time lag. Time lag is basically the time space, the difference between an action taken and the effect seen. Maybe a change in the monetary policy has been taken and the effect is witnessed after 1 month or a week or 15 days or 6 months. So Keynes assumed that immediately if a variable is changed, its impact is seen on the other variable. So there is no time lag. A condition of underemployment is being seen in the equilibrium. Further, Keynes took the saving investment function and he took interest as a monetary phenomenon. That means interest was taken as a monetary phenomenon. It do exist. The impact of interest would be analyzed on the investment decisions taken by the individuals. Now, when we say that effective demand is equal to the place where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply, that is the point of determination of effective demand. Now, what is this effective demand and effective demand price? See, a producer, a manufacturer, an entrepreneur analyzes what and how much he or she produces in a specific time period. That means the total amount of money which all the producers expect to receive by selling the output produced. A specific output, when they are producing that output, what amount of money they'll receive by selling those output. For that production of output, what the producer has to do? The producer has to employ labor today. What level of employment? Say, if the producer is employing 100 people, that means what? And producing 500 units of a product, and from 500 unit of a product, by selling those product, the producer is getting certain amount of money. So what happens when the producer says ki for producing 500 units through which I'll be getting profit, how much labor should I employ today so that in a future date I'll get the amount by selling that product or goods or services produced. Thus, it refers to the expected revenue from sale of output at a particular point of time. If we see the aggregate demand price schedule, what do we see? Level of employment is taken in lakhs, aggregate demand price in rupees crore. See, if 20 lakh laborers are employed today, the producer will get 230 crores. These are hypothetical figures, what I have taken to explain, to make you understand the concept of aggregate demand price. Further, as the level of employment is increased, the aggregate demand price, the returns for the producer also increases. As we are increasing the level of employment, the aggregate demand price is increasing 250, 260, 270, 280 and 290. Next important concept comes of aggregate supply price, another component of effective demand. Now, when an entrepreneur employs labor for production of certain things, that labor needs to be paid in the form of wages. Along with labor, there are certain cooperant factors in the form of raw material, in the form of capital. Labor would be working, he would be requiring certain raw materials, a piece of land must be there, maybe machinery the entrepreneur or the manufacturer producer has to purchase, all that needs to be paid. So, when an entrepreneur gives employment to certain amount of labor, it requires certain quantities of cooperant factors in the form of raw material, land, capital. These factors also need to be paid by the entrepreneur. Thus, level of employment involves certain money cost. And aggregate supply price, that is ASP, it refers to a schedule showing aggregate supply price received at different levels of employment. Now, when we see the level of employment and aggregate supply price schedule, what do we see? See, aggregate supply price is increasing. That means this is the amount which the producer is incurring to pay the laborer and other cooperant factors. This is, so when 20 lakh laborers are employed, the supply price is 250, and as the number of employed is increasing, the level of employment is increasing, aggregate supply price is increasing. And since Keynes has taken this concept, the theory of employment runs for short period, you see aggregate supply price after 40, that means what? When the level of employment reaches 40 lakh, after that, if there is no scope for hiring new labor, that means what? The full employment has been achieved, and if you are still producing after this full employment with no change in resource raise, only the aggregate supply price is increasing. So, if we combine aggregate demand and aggregate supply price, what do we see? We see that as the level of employment is increasing, the aggregate demand price is also increasing and the aggregate supply price is also increasing, but the level of employment becomes constant in this. That is, after the attainment of 40 lakh laborers are employed, after that there is no scope for further increase in level of employment. Thus, what Keynes said, that level of employment would be determined at the place where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. And in this, you can very clearly see that this is the point where AD and AS are equal to each other. That means when the level of employment is 35 lakh, then aggregate supply price is 260 and aggregate demand price is also 260. So the level of employment would be 35 lakh people. See, these are arbitrary figures. You can change these figures for explaining. This schedule has been only taken to make you understand the concept of aggregate demand, aggregate supply and effective demand. See, graphically what we see, on x-axis we have taken the level of employment, on y-axis we have taken expected receipts and the supply price, what the entrepreneur is incurring to produce goods and services. Now what happens? Even when the level of employment is at 0, then also aggregate demand exists. Why so? Because the labor who is employed is also a consumer. and that labor is spending from its maybe past savings or wealth. So slowly as the level of employment is increasing, aggregate demand is increasing. See, this is the aggregate demand curve, and aggregate supply is also increasing. Now, if we take the level of employment at N1, at this level of employment, the expected ON1 is the level of employment. At this point of time, the expected receipts would be OH, and the supply price for these receipts will be OH1. See, thus demand is more than supply, aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. At this place also, the producer will further use the resources available, use the factors available, employ more labor as demand is more than supply. So there is a scope for further increase in the production level. So what happens? Slowly, the level of employment is increased and it reaches to N2. N2 becomes a place where AD is intersecting AS at point E. At this point, what is there? Aggregate demand is OM and aggregate supply is also OM. That means the point E is the point of effective demand where AD is equal to AS. Keynes also said one thing, that point of effective demand need not be the point of full employment. See, the full employment is at NF. So, the difference between NF and N2 is involuntary unemployment, that there exists an excess capacity. So, what happens? Now, after this, still ER is still a scope where the producer can increase the aggregate demand till the point aggregate supply becomes constant, that if you see in the schedule, when it goes to 40 laborers, 40 units of people employed. And now, how can we increase this aggregate demand? See, Keynes said that national income depends on effective demand, what we have discussed earlier, and this effective demand depends on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is given. In the schedule, what we have discussed, it's 40. The level of employment when reaches 40 lakh, the aggregate supply becomes constant. Why aggregate supply becomes constant? Because this aggregate supply depends on many factors, many psychological and institutional factors that we'll be discussing. That means the attitude, the taste, the further enhancement. So, in short run, supply cannot be increased. Taste and preference of the people don't change so easily. The purchasing habits don't change. The choices don't change. There are various institutional factors. It is not necessary the money supply can be increased. The policy changes can happen. So, in short run, the aggregate supply after a point of time is given and becomes constant. Now, when we talk of aggregate demand has two components. One is the consumption demand and the other one is investment demand. That means what? Our income is divided into two parts, consumption and savings. And since the Keynes has assumed that government doesn't play any role as a spender or a taxer, so we are not taking the government spending or taxes. So this supply is identical to investment. From this this saving is identical to investment. So what we are doing? That forms the consumption demand. So consumption depends on how much proportion of income we are consuming, that is the propensity to consume, and our income. Our income would definitely determine the level of consumption. The level of consumption and our income relationship we will be discussing in the next topic of consumption function, how this relationship works. So for this section, I am only giving you a brief idea that income is the amount what we are earning, and propensity to consume is the proportion of income what we are spending. That further is divided into average propensity to consume and marginal propensity to consume. Now this investment depends on, again, two factors. One is the marginal efficiency of capital. Marginal efficiency of capital is the rate of return. See, machines say what it at a specific price, and if a machine has a life of 10 years, so what output the machine would be giving me in 10 years and what returns I'll be getting. So it is like a interest, a rate. Marginal efficiency of capital is like a rate. That depends on the demand price, what output we are getting from this machine, selling it and earning those output when we are selling, as well as supply price. That means at what cost we are getting that particular machine to produce capital goods. Second is the rate of interest. See, Keynes, it relates to the theory of liquidity preference, theory of interest given by Keynes, in which he said, he very beautifully defined interest and said, interest is the reward for parting with your liquidity. And he said, this, why do we invest? Out of income, why do we consume? That depends on the supply of money. Supply of money is basically done in the earlier lectures of money supply, what constitutes the money supply, and the liquidity preference. That means we need cash for what? We need cash for transactions motive. That means if I am taking LT, LT is a proportion of my income. That means LT is a proportion of my income. A specific amount that I'll spend out of my income. That is an increasing function. If my income is increasing, the proportion for transactions, for exchange, for purchasing, I'll keep more. Then is the precautionary motive. Precautionary motive is for any kind of uncertainty that we keep a certain amount of liquid assets with us, so that if something happens, we can spend that money. Was given by Keynes as precautionary motive. And speculative motive. Achha, one thing more I like to tell, that transaction motive and precautionary motive were interest inelastic. Howsoever, the speculative motive is the object of securing profit from the market by knowing better what the future will bring forth. So this is interest elastic. That means we will invest in the market according to the interest given. Very briefly, I am telling you the liquidity preference theory. However, there is a separate theory and a long theory, but this is what would determine the aggregate demand. So these factors would be responsible for change in aggregate demand. These are all things that I have already told you: the propensity to consume, the size of the national income, and the investment. That depends on rate of interest and marginal efficiency of capital, which again depends on prospective yield and supply price. Since aggregate depends on investment demand and consumption demand, the aggregate demand curve witnesses a shift from AD to AD dash, where the effective demand points shift from E to E1. This would be the point where economy can achieve full employment. Remember, we can achieve full employment, but the point of effective demand is not necessarily the point of full employment. It can come prior to full employment as well. Further, if we increase the demand from E1 point, what would happen? See, after this point, what is happening? The supply is becoming constant. So supply price would increase, incurring a loss to the producer. So producer will not produce after this point in short run. Further, Keynes also discussed the income and output relationship. As I said, our income is consumption plus saving, or we can write Y is equal to C plus I, that is investment. And consumption again depends on the proportion of our income what we are spending. So the income output relationship can be Y is equal to A plus BY plus I. These were the few criticisms of the Keynes theory, because this theory also had certain criticism that the concept of equilibrium was self-contradictory, it can be changed. Keynes economics, being in short run, were treated more as a static concept. It was criticized on the basis that it ignores long-run equilibrium. Unrealistic assumption of perfect competition, because it is very hard to inculcate all the characteristics of perfect competition. It was not a general theory, it was specific theory. Closed economy assumption was also criticized, that means we are restricting the impact of other variables on the level of employment. It was not empirical as well. That was a theoretical aspect given by Keynes, and it was over aggregative. However, the Keynes theory, in spite of taking labor as a unit, in spite of taking rate of interest, which was not a purely monetary phenomenon, is important. Why? Because first and foremost, determination of employment. That means what? He gave the concept of effective demand that could determine the level of employment. And when effective demand increases, the level of employment can also be increased, as we have seen in the way the AD was shifted. It repudiated the Say's law of market. He said full employment is a special condition, not always a normal condition, as well as supply always doesn't create its own demand. And he also highlighted the significance of role of investment in employment. That means what? Our income is again spent between C and I. So, Keynes theory of employment holds a very important position in the macroeconomic theory base. Hope you have understood this, and your self-evaluation question for today would be: the logical starting point of Keynes theory of employment is the principle of effective demand. Discuss. I think you will be in a position to answer this. These are few selected readings for macroeconomics that include Branson William, Blanchard Oliver, Shapiro Edward, and Rana and Verma. These readings will definitely help you to enhance your understanding. So learners, thank you for today.